Hey, today we're doing a demo on Scrappy binding, and there's a few reasons why you may want to use Scrappy binding. For one thing, it uses up fabric that you may have left over. So you can think just leftover bits of fabric that you end up, you could put those in a basket and use them for binding when the time comes. Or in my case, I have this leftover fat quarter situation going on, and I thought, well, why not use this leftover fabric instead of throwing it back in my stash? So that's another thought. But one of the things that I really like is for the binding to, go around the quilt and then just be pops of different colors. So here's my quilt. This is the honey pie quilt, which I've made it in the forget-me-not fabrics. And you can see that it has just all of this white, right? So lots of white, particularly because it has all this white. I thought it would be fun for it to have pops in the binding. Here's the fabrics I'm going to use. And then in some of this, it'll just kind of blend in with the other whites because I've got, some whites here. But then every now and then it'll have this pop of like dark blue. I thought that would be really cute. I've done it before and loved it. So I thought I'd make a demo of it, and that's what we're going to do today. Let me just get the pattern pulled up here on my phone, and I need binding. It says I need 3/4 yards of binding, but like I said, I'm just going to use these fat quarters and then just work out the math myself, because patterns, never have scrappy binding. I mean, that would be like a major extra. It says I need 7 width of fabric strips, and it's referring to 42-inch. So since this is only 22-inch wide fabric, I'm going to double up. So instead of 7 width of fabric strips, I'm going to double that to 14, and I'm going to cut 1 extra since I've got more seams, just to give me a little bit of leeway here. So I'm going to cut 15 fat quarter strips. So let me get these pressed and then start cutting. I haven't used scrappy binding in a while, so excited. And then whatever it tells you, if you're working on a different pattern, if it tells you you need 8 strips, 6 strips, whatever it tells you, you just cut those from different fabrics, and then you've got your strips for your scrappy binding. And then I like using fat quarters a little bit more because it means that your binding is going to change fabrics more often, because fat quarter are only 22 inches wide. So I'm going to get these all pressed. And you definitely want to press fabric before cutting it, because you're not going to have accurate cuts if you don't. And I'm using starch just to give me a little bit more accuracy. Starch makes fabrics crisp, and crisp fabric cuts better. Okay, here we are. Sip of coffee first. Oh, that's hot. All right, we're cutting 15 strips. You go ahead and just kind of lay these fabrics out ready to cut. I just want to make sure that I don't have my white fabrics together. That way there'll be a break in the different looks, if that makes sense. I think I've done it. I think I've got it pretty. Well, let me do this white after the dark blue. That way I'll have they're low volume fabrics. That way it'll be spaced evenly instead of this long white strip of binding running on the quilt. I think that would look best. Obviously, come up with your favorite plan for your binding. One time I made a quilt and it had like this pop of yellow in the binding, and the rest of the binding was just, really similar to the quilt top, but then there was this pop of yellow, and it was just such an eye grabber, and it looked so pretty, and I've thought about that quilt ever since. Since there's so many low volumes in this particular stack of fabric, I want to use those the least. So 6 fabrics. Let me just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I need 15, so I'm going to cut them both twice, and then I'll cut a few fabrics, 3 strips from it. All right. I'm cutting my strips at 2 1/4. I know that my pattern's always to say 2 1/2 inches, but I actually prefer working with 2 1/4. When I'm machine binding, which I'm not going to do this time, but when I'm machine binding, I cut them at 2 inches. So, use what's best for you. If you struggle with binding, it's better to start with a 2 1/2 inch. All right, so 2 1/4. I have to pay attention to these measurements to get 2 1/4 accurate. All right, that's 6 strips. 12 strips. I'm not going to use all of these. Oh, I still got plenty of fabric for my stash. I've got 12 strips. 1, 2, 3. So these are coming out. 1, 2 1/4. Line up my lines on my ruler with the lines on my mat and cut. All right, so I have still lots of fabric left over. All this is extra. And then I've got my 15 strips, 15 fat quarter strips. Let's go sew them together. All right, I forgot to cut my selvage off. So I'm just gonna do it right here at the sewing machine. I forgot about selvage. Do as straight a line as we can do. Obviously, normally, I will cut that off with my rotary cutter and my ruler, but I'm blanking today. Not as quick as the normal way when you've got it folded over. That I have a routine for that method, and it's just really great. So when it's fat quarters, it's not quite as easy, but still completely doable. And if you prefer to sew these together on the diagonal, do your own thing here. That part doesn't matter. Whatever your preference is, use that. I like sewing them together like this, so that's what I do. Okay, I've got my long strip of binding. Let's go to the pressing mat. So I want to start pressing where I want to start the binding. So I wanted to start the binding with this dark blue. So this is where I want to start my pressing. And before we fold it over and make it into binding, we are just going to press those seams open. So let me run through this. Really quick. This is kind of the workflow I use. It's just I keep moving it from one side of the pressing mat to the other. Obviously, you're going to have your own workflow, what works out best for you. We all find our little ways of getting something done, and you need to find yours. So let me get all these seams pressed open, and I'll be back. Okay, did it. Here's what that looks like in case you need a little look. So now I'm just going to move these over here, get it in some kind of order, because I'm just kind of throwing it around right now. All right, so here we go. Again, starting with the piece I want to start with. And I'm just going to flip it over just like this. Let me get you a close view. Flipping it over just like that, and then start pressing it. Usually put the iron right here or right here, and then just kind of move this to down this side, and then just keep going. So still going, and I'm just kind of moving myself down the length of this binding strip. And I know they make all kinds of little, contraptions to make this super easy, but if I'm being completely honest, the basic way of doing it, to me, is the easiest way. I mean, I don't know what could get more easier than this right here. I mean, look how fast I'm going. So I guess if you're new to binding, those new contraptions and notions may seem really tempting to you, but I've tried so many of them, and I've never liked anything other than this. All right, so I'm going to keep going down the length of this, and then I will see you when I got it done. So again, here's another big preference thing. We've got our binding made, and everybody has their own way of doing this, so I'm just going to show you mine, and it just starts right here. I kind of make a little honey bun, and then I just start rolling it up like this. I know some people who fold it. I know some people who wrap it around old thread cones. So find your way of doing it. Find what works best for you. There's no right or wrong way. And we are just going to, and I started rolling, the side I didn't want to use. So I started at the very end piece. But you can see how the binding is looking now, and how it's going to be kind of spotted around the quilt. Not for every quilt, but I think it's really nice for quilts with, background at the edges. Not a lot of foreground fabrics. Obviously, I would never do this binding on a trippy quilt because it would just be over the top. But for a quilt with a lot of background, I think it's going to look great. All right, here's my honey bun. And there's what that binding is going to end up looking like right around the quilt. So let's go sew it on our quilt. Quilt on this side, binding on this side. Let me show you this. I've already sewn my label on my quilt. I've got a whole separate tutorial if you are interested in sewing labels on your quilt. But basically, I sell these at Meander and Make, and they're personalized for you. And then I just hand stitch it, you know, right across the top, just your basic stitch. And then you leave the two edges right here raw, and they get caught up in the back in the binding, right? So the binding folds over, and then you've got a nice clean finish to your quilt. Nobody will ever forget that you made this. All right, so back to binding. I always just start, you know, in the middle of one of the sides and then roll off a little bit. I like to leave like, I don't know, 8 to 10 inches right here. I'm using my basic sew fine thread, and I'm going to use, I always use a scant 1/4 inch, but definitely use what you want. If you want a 1/4 inch, go for it. I'm actually going to open this, my cabinet up a little bit, because the extra surface will keep my quilt on a little bit better. I won't have to be pulling it and dragging it and what have you. Back to this. I'm going to start out back stitching, a couple stitches. That was more like 4 stitches. And then we begin. I just hold my binding, you know, to the edge of the quilt, you know, flush with the edge of the quilt. And I unroll this as I go. I just hold it on there. This part of the binding is so easy, but you know, I'm going to spend days stitching it finished. Oh, let me say that too. This is sewing your binding on. Finishing it is finishing it, right? So when you hand sew it, you're finishing your binding, but this is sewing it onto the quilt. Just in case you're a new quilter, get the verbiage accurate so you know what people are talking about. I'm going to stop a 1/4 inch away, so it's a little bit more than a 1/4 inch. I'm going to back stitch 3 or 4 stitches, cut my thread. And then I'm going to shift the whole quilt just like we do. So I'm going down the opposite side. All right, here's the tricky part. This is the part that got me when I first started quilting. So you want to take your binding, and then you want to, I kind of hold my finger right here where I want, where that stitch is, where my last little stitch is, and I hold my finger there, and then I go up, just like that. And then basically this part of the binding is in line with this edge of the quilt. It's easier if you put it down. And then I'm holding it there. I'm holding this diagonal line, holding it there, and then I'm going to bring it right back up on top of itself. And I want to make sure that I get everything nice and lined up so that we've got something that looks just like this. Let me do that again for you. Got it right here. I put my fingernail right where those stitches end. I go up, then I hold right here where I want the fold to be, which is basically the edge of my quilt. I'm putting my thumb there and folding back on my thumb. And then I just kind of get everything in line, just like this. It's easier to do on a surface than holding it up. All right, and then I'm going to get it back. I don't start at the very edge of the quilt. I bring it in a few stitches. That way I can back stitch all the way to the edge of the quilt and then go. And that's what we're going to do at every single corner. I know a lot of people will pin this. A lot of people will use those Wonder clips, clip it. Some people glue it. Whatever you want to do. I don't do any of that. I just kind of hold it here and sew it. It works out great. But definitely, if you find easier ways to do this, go with what's easiest for you. All right, I'm going to finish sewing my binding on, and then I'll show you how to join the two ends of the binding. So I overestimated. I've got too much binding, but that's okay. All right, so we're going to join the two ends. I'm going to grab scissors and a pen. So got these two things. You can use any kind of marking that you want. You don't necessarily have to use, your basic pen. But I want to leave a gap, and I don't know, this might be like 8 inches, something like that. But I want to go ahead. I've stopped sewing here. I've stopped sewing right here. And I'm just going to back stitch, cut my thread. All right, so now we've got these two ends, and I've obviously got way too much, so I'm just going to pick a place way over here and just cut this off. I can either save this for another quilt, or I can throw it in my scrap bin, whatever you want to do with it. When I first started quilting and I first learned about scrappy binding, I would just keep adding to these rolls with other leftover binding. And, it was always already made. So you would just add on to it and then, keep going. So that's something that you could do if you hate binding. I don't know anybody who hates binding. I love it so much. It's my favorite part. But if you are somebody who doesn't like it, then this could be something that you save and then add on to it with every little piece of this from each of your quilts. So now we're going to take both of these ends into our hands, and we're going to try to like meet in the middle, right? So meet in the middle, like right in here. I'm just going to put them together, but I want to put them together really tight, and you can see that I'm leaving, a tail here and then a tail here. I like to put this arm through the throat of my machine and pull this edge of the quilt, and then this edge I kind of just press my torso and hold it. I pull and I hold the quilt steady where it doesn't move right here, and then over here I'm giving it a pull, and then I'm just going to keep pinching my fingers together like this until I've got this taut. You don't want it, obviously you don't want it like that where, it folds the quilt, but you want it as taut as you can get it without the quilt bucking. All right, and when I think I've got it, I'm just going to lay it all to this side, grab that marking pen, and I like to make a little line where I feel the ridge of the other binding. So if you push your finger right here, you can feel that ridge, and I'm just going to draw a line where that is, and then I flip all of this excess to the opposite side, and I put another drawn line right there. You can't see it on the dark blue, but I can. Then we let everything go, and we take this binding, this one that's coming from the top side of our quilt. We take it and open it up, and there's my drawn line. Then we take this binding, this end. I'm going to fold this quilt up a little bit, just a little bit, so that I can take this, there's my line. I'm going to put that line on this crease that I've made with the iron. So right down the middle, I'm going to put this edge, this folded part of the binding, I'm going to put it flush with the drawn line right there. So get it sorted. If you need pins, use your pins. All right, and then when you've got it, I like to just hold it, get all the wrinkles out of this, because it might be like bunched a little bit. It's okay for it to be a little bunched, but you don't want it to be bunched where this is going to be. Then, holding it in place, open this up, right? Keep holding, turn everything this way, right? So that I'm going in at an angle, and then start sewing. And I'm just holding it in place. And I want to sew in a straight line from here, where I started, to right there, where it ends. Cut my thread, and then this part I can cut away. So I'm going to cut 1/4 inch away from that stitch line. And again, this can go in the scrap bin, or it can go in your binding stash maybe. All right, now this lays exactly how you need it to lay to finish it up. So right where we stop stitching, we're going to start stitching. I actually overlap it a little bit. All right, I'm going to back stitch. And then I'm going to just make sure that this little seam right there, I'm just going to fold it really nice and neat so that it's not, you know, got a big bundle up under there. Hold it down. So, your quilt when you need to. Keep holding it down. And then when I get to this other stitch line, I back stitch, cut my thread, and voila, done. All right, here is that binding sewn on. And I need to decide whether I'm going to hand stitch it the traditional way or hand stitch it the chunky thread way. And then I'll spend a few evenings, you know, finishing this binding. I'll let you know what I decide, and I'll show it to you when I get it done. I finished. Took me 2 evenings, maybe 2 to 3 hours each evening to do the chunky hand stitch. I'm going to give you a better close-up in a minute, but there's that chunky hand stitch. If you like this, I have a demo for specifically how to do this. And let me go ahead and say that one of the main questions I get about that binding technique is it as strong as the traditional? And I would say yes. I've been using this, I don't know, 4 or 5 years. I don't know how long. It might just be 3 years, but it's been several years, and I've basically gone to every single one of my quilt using this chunky hand stitch. And at first I just love doing it. It's slow and it's so pretty. But I think it just gives it a little something extra, and you get some final moments with your quilt, you know, spending that last few moments, you know, making it. There's just something about the quilt's journey versus, you know, having a finished quilt. I like the making of it. I like the journey. So again, we have that demo if you're interested. All right, but as for how the Scrappy binding looks on the quilt, let me back up here. I'm not sure you can see it. My table's going to be in the way. You can see how the binding transitions, how it transitions from one to the next. It's just a little something extra. And again, I probably would never use it on a quilt that did not have this much background. I think it looks best on the quilts that do. But I really just like those transitions. I like the transition from dark to light. I mean, it's binding. Binding is very narrow, so it's not some huge standout ordeal on your quilt. It's just a little tiny something subtle. So it's just so subtle, but it's just so, it just adds so much, I think. I'm so happy. I'm so happy I thought to do it. I might actually do it on another one of the quilts as well because I had all these leftover fabric and I just kept thinking, what a great way to use those fabrics. Well, I think that's all. I'm sorry that this video is so long. I hope you enjoyed the Scrappy binding, even if you never use it. And if you do use it, or it's the first time you've heard of it, please leave me a comment. I love reading about your journeys as well. And yeah, thanks for watching. I will see you next time.